Welcome back to the Frontier Faith Podcast. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jeff, and today we're going to continue our study in 1 Corinthians. This is lesson 4, and we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which I just preached a lesson here at the Valley Church of Christ yesterday. And this is a packed chapter with all sorts of stuff, and this is talking about different relationships, and the sermon title was Christ at the Center of Our Relationships. And so we're going to continue some of our discussion from yesterday and explore some things in this chapter that are pretty fascinating and instructive. And one of the things I thought would be good for us to begin as we think about this chapter is, this comes right on the heels of some of the things you were talking about in our previous podcast and previous lesson about sexual immorality in chapters 5 and in chapters 6. Because as he goes into chapter 7, he begins by saying, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, quote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." It seems like to me, Mike, that there's some ideas going around. Paul has already written to them. We know that in chapter 5 that he has already encouraged them to avoid sexual immorality, and he's expounding on some of that in chapters 5 and chapter 6, chapter 7. And he begins to talk about marriage and singleness and divorce and widowhood and some of these sensitive relationships. But I'm just curious, as you were listening to the sermon and thinking about chapter 7, after all the study you've put in chapter 5 and 6 and his strong teaching on sexual immorality, how do you see some of these thoughts work out in chapter 7?
Well, kind of like in the chapters 5 and 6, he's kind of like x-raying the body of Christ at the moment and realizing there's some real broken bones here and there with these relationships that are really out of bounds. And then chapter 7 and a little bit onward, he's now showing what the arm is supposed to do. Instead of just pointing out how things are broken, he's now pointing out the purpose of what these desires and what these relationships are supposed to be about. And I think that kind of takes shape with living as you're called, and it's not just about satisfying urges. It's about having a certain kind of purpose from God in every moment of your life. And like the theme of our series of showing how Christ needs to be at the center. And so it's almost like 5 and 6 is out of bounds, 7 is inbounds.
Right. It's interesting because from what we understand, at least from my studies, Corinth, the church in Corinth is relatively young as he's writing this letter, and predominantly Gentile. There's definitely some Jewish presence there, but mostly Gentile, at least based on the type of instructions he's giving. He assumes a lot of ignorance. There's definitely correction. We saw that in chapter 5 as the man was sleeping with his stepmom, but there's also just a lot of direction. And you see that kind of come out, and it seems like we don't have the letter, but they've written some questions to him. So chapter 7, verse 1 says, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. That phrase is repeated a few times. First verse of chapter 8, now concerning food offered to idols. We know that. And he goes on talking about that subject. He talks about that with spiritual gifts. Verse 1 of chapter 12, concerning spiritual gifts, brothers. So concerning this, talks about the collection in chapter 16. And so he's giving some direction, but I think a big part of Paul's agenda in writing, and really all of his epistles, but uniquely in 1 Corinthians, is and one of the questions I think helps guide our study is like, how does a church, how does an individual, but how does a congregation make a full conversion from the culture in which they're situated to Christ and to his cross, right? And so as he's talking about fleeing sexual immorality at the end of chapter 6, like running for your life from this, like take this seriously. How do you do that? Well, maybe they have some ideas of their own, like, well, maybe I just need to absolve this marriage altogether and live like a monk the rest of my life. And that was present in different philosophical circles of the time of like, oh, maybe marriage is just a burden on the flesh, and so I need to detach from the world.
I wonder if that was driven. I wonder if their divisions with and quarreling over different teachers was being driven by some of them finding teachers that were either more, in their understanding, less strict on sexual immorality
Hmm.
or family responsibilities, or maybe they were just like there was nothing spoken explicitly about said things, and so kind of finding teachers to suit their own passions. They were even finding good teachers that, in the absence of certain teachings, they gravitate. And we see that kind of with people talking about like red letter Bibles, where
Sure.
they have scriptures that are only the words of Jesus and exclude the words of the apostles or things like that. So I wonder if they were looking for um, teachers or teachings that could enable certain practices that were not appropriate, and then but they were, because they had different teachers and different things, they then had different standards on what to pursue together. I wonder if that was part of the fuel for their tensions.
Yeah. It seems like there was two dominant ideas that were circulating the cultural waters of the time. One was asceticism, and the other was Gnosticism. So Gnosticism was like this divorce of the soul and the body. It's the secret knowledge and sort of go into a higher plane, and so that really allowed anything was permissible body wise because but asceticism was becoming detached, like being so restrictive. So you kind of have either overindulgence or underindulgence or whatever a better word for that is. And it seems like Paul's kind of correcting both of those extremes because typically in their culture and in ours, sex has been and culture is made like an ultimate thing, like everything revolves around it. And the church has historically reacted to that to say like it's kind of like taboo. We don't talk about
It's the
that.
carnal nature.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And even have people have read 1 Corinthians 7 in that way, as Paul's almost just like just giving an out to it. It's like, uh,
Regulate some evil, could
yeah,
put some blocks on this animal behavior, keep it
right,
in check.
right, yeah. And so I think Paul is correcting both of those.
Sure.
And it seems like in this chapter he does the opposite happens in marriage, where marriage is like in culture is viewed as a very low thing. Just kind of throw it away. It doesn't matter. We saw that in some Jewish traditions that Jesus is responding to. You know, it's the Pharisees. Then why did Moses command us to give a certificate of divorce? And Jesus responds by saying, like, actually, he permitted you to do this, but that was never the intent, right? So there was a divorce for convenience sort of mindset, even in Jewish culture, but especially like no fault divorce was a present reality in Corinth and been a present reality in our own culture. Whereas the church has had like a super high view of marriage, where it almost becomes like an ultimate spiritual state, where you're like a super Christian if you're married. And so Paul seems to, in both the sex and marriage, is correcting overreactions, um, either way. So thinking about this chapter, think about how he approaches this. So he responds, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, like that's what they're suggesting. So he corrects that by bringing up two separate circumstances in life, marriage and singleness. And he lumps a couple things under singleness. You have like the one who's never married, you have the one who's betrothed, you have the widow, you have the one who's gone through a divorce, and he speaks into those. But in general, these two states he talks about is like, okay, there's a place for marriage and there's a place for singleness, and one should not be viewed as superior to the other. In fact, he says there actually might be some benefits to being single. So, what are some thoughts that come to your mind as we think about what Paul says about marriage and then what Paul says about singleness?
Well, it shows as a congregation in Corinth that they had a wide spectrum of beliefs on the subject, because you have a member who is being super promiscuous with his
Hmm.
family member
Right.
and them flaunting that. But then you also have them corresponding with Paul saying it is good for a woman not to or it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. So it's like they can't pick a lane
Yeah.
here. They're kind of all over the place
Exactly.
within, and they're still a congregation. So I think that's really interesting to have a church that is so diverse in their current convictions on things. But then I really like the equalizing Paul does of showing the place for sexuality, the design of sexuality, and also uh, the the goalpost orientation Paul shows here of having Christ at the center of your life is how you are an optimized believer. It's not about being married or single,
Hmm.
that you are a spiritual person, and that the center of 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 Christianity is Christ, not any particular role or experience here on earth.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something that's come out that I've been convicted by in this study of First Corinthians really goes all the way back to your first lesson and the first chapter or two of the book, because as Paul's talking about being saints together, and he's talking about wisdom that's oriented around a cross, like that is like the starting point to understand every other thing he talks about
Right.
in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this idea that it is not about your circumstance is not what makes you spiritual. It's what God has done through Christ and his spirit in you.
It's kind of like the question, it is good for a man not to have sexual. You could almost like put a pause in there. Like it is good pause. Like the 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 goal here is trying to figure out what is good.
Hmm.
And Paul is zooming out to show what is good, and makes me think of Jesus's conversation when someone approached him, good teacher. And
Hmm.
like, why do you call me good? Only God is good.
Hmm.
And really kind of helping showcase the reality that if you're looking for what is good, then you need to be looking for God. You're
Hmm.
not going to find goodness in your local environment. You're only going to find goodness with Christ on the cross.
Right. And so as far as like whether sex is good or not good, it's like, well, God is the one who orients that, and
Right.
he
Depends on Christ.
yeah, he's created that. And so I think that's part of what Paul is appealing to. Is like it is good for like imagine Paul reading this like it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, and he's probably reading this like, well, yes or no.
Yeah. Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
it depends. It's not a because it's not about the act itself, but what does this act symbolize, and is it fulfilling its creational intent? Because he talks about marriage here in verse 2 through 5, and he talks about it elsewhere as well, but he does speak to the the good side of it, the role that sex has. Like, because I mean, not to give, not to be too hard on the Corinthians. Like, if this is the first time I've ever read this, and like, if I'm the church in Corinth and this letter was read in one sitting, after reading what he just said in chapter 5 and in chapter 6, I might be the first one saying the first verse of chapter 7, like,
Yeah.
boy, maybe we just need to like get rid of this altogether. Maybe the ascetics were right. Maybe we just need to strip this whole thing. Maybe I just need to divorce my wife, and that way I can be completely dedicated. But he pauses that and read for us verse 2 through 5.
But because of the temptation to sexual morality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another. except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control.
Man, so there's a whole lot there. What are some thoughts that come to your mind at reading this? Like particularly that first verse. I mean, he's been talking about sexual immorality. He says literally verse 18 of chapter 6, flee from sexual immorality. He talks about the uniqueness of sexual immorality as being something against you do against your own body. He says you're not your own, you're bought with a price. There, glorify God in your body. And so then he says, but because of the temptation to sexual morality.
Yeah. So the two big things that stand out to me in this is the first is like you mentioned, going back to chapter 6 of you are not your own, you bought with price. That the ownership of you is is Christ who owns you, but then that ownership in marriage is delegated out to your spouse to
Mm-hmm.
where you are not your own, you are also your spouse's. You are
Mm,
Christ and you are your spouse's
that's a good point.
because this idea here of your body, in um, verse 4, you don't have authority over your own body, but your spouse does.
Mm-hmm.
So you're mutually married to each other and you mutually have authority over each other. And that authority has been delegated through the highest owner who's bought us with a price. And so, in defining the relationship, knowing that I'm not my own, God owns me. And
Mm-hmm.
in his ownership, he has given authority in marriage over one another. And so that creates kind of a head scratching dynamic where we both have authority over each other. And,
Yeah.
you know, uh, and so that gives you a lot of, I think, need for pause and reflection of and responsibility of what responsibility do I have in having authority over someone, and what responsibility do I have in response to the authority over me,
Mm-hmm.
and in providing um and also in directing, and that's mutual. And so that's kind of an uncomfortable concept of, because, okay, God having authority over me,
Mm-hmm.
I trust him. He's perfect. Somebody else having authority over me, they're not perfect. And so
Mm-hmm.
that is vulnerable. So that in itself has massive implications in a relationship, knowing that you each have authority over each other, and that authority comes from God. And that's not a bug, it's a feature of the relationship. And in part of that relationship, we see a spiritual warfare dynamic with this, where if there is an improper relationship of treatment towards one another in this intimacy, this sexual relation, that the improper dynamic together creates a vulnerability for Satan to
Mm-hmm.
get involved in this. So that shows the really there's a susceptibility here in being disregarding towards one another and not taking this relationship seriously. So it's like when you go camping and during the summer here in Alaska, and if you leave a bunch of food in your tent while you're
Mm-hmm.
sleeping there, you're just like, you know what you're inviting in,
Right.
but is
Right.
there a bear gonna come the moment you open a Pop Tart in the tent? Probably not. But there's a recklessness, a foolishness,
Mm-hmm.
a vulnerability that you are totally capable of not causing if you have some proper practices together. And so just knowing that there's a predator that you invite in by having inappropriate awareness and sensitivity to each other shows that marriage has massive spiritual
Mm,
implications
yeah,
with the Lord as authority given, and also with Satan having an avenue if things are mishandled.
man, those are really good connections. I not actually made that explicit connection between the idea of like God having authority over our body because we were bought with a price, and then my spouse having authority over my body. That's pretty fascinating because what marriage is understood to be is God joining
Mm-hmm.
two people. And that's
Exactly.
what Jesus responds, like what God has joined together,
Yeah.
let man not separate. And so God is forging these two to be one flesh. And so then if you are married, how should you read the end of chapter 16? You should read it like, y'all are not your own. Y'all were bought with a
Or
price, right?
chapter 6. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, sorry. End of chapter 6. Y'all are not your own. Y'all are bought with a price. Like if you really are one flesh, if that's a spiritual reality that has been created by God that we should not separate, then and if you are, like you are now bought with a price. Your marriage is bought with a price. You are together. And so, how does that manifest itself, particularly in sexual intimacy between a husband and a wife? It's this mutuality of, and I think it's fascinating. And I think I highlighted this yesterday was that the idea of a husband having authority over his wife's body in a Greco-Roman context would be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like that wouldn't be too shocking. And I think Paul knows that. And then he left hooks, right? He says, also, husbands, you don't have authority over your own bodies. And that might be one of the most countercultural things Paul writes. Is like, wait, what?
Or anyone has written.
Or anyone's written. Yeah, like it is such a against the grain type of idea, but it's true that both the husband, both the wife have authority over one another. And so, like, what would a marriage look like if you really believed that and
Yeah.
really lived into that? Yeah, and I also appreciate, yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, there's sometimes it's easy for us to think about our marriages as being just sort of a standalone. This is our thing. It's just me and Amber and our marriage and its own private experience. And Paul seems to just let the spiritual reality of marriage just come out. First of all, you're bought with a price, but then if you are to abstain for a while, and he mentions to dedicate yourselves to prayer, but then do it for a short time, let Satan tempt you. It's like it's just I don't understand it all, but there's spiritual dynamics and spiritual warfare at
And
play here.
it's something that I think is uncomfortable for a lot of people to talk about. It's understandable, but like conjugal rights, we usually only ever talk about that in like prison settings and or
Yeah,
like,
right.
penitentiary. And I don't think that's ever come up with like marriage counseling or someone's like conjugal is not a word I use in my like weekly
Yeah,
conversations with people.
it's probably good.
And it's also not like a very romantic term either.
Mm-hmm.
Conjugal. It just sounds really legalistic or just cold. Um, and I think that's something that men and women in marriage need to be aware of for each other. Of like, I need to be proactive in providing this for this other person, and it's a not trying to get my fix, but trying to be sensitive in providing for the other.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't give you a schedule here of like how often
Right.
but it has to have a sensitivity to one another in it. And if you are like delinquent in that, if you are irresponsible with that, then the evil that that invites, and that you can have an abstaining from it only temporarily for the purpose of prayer, which is awesome as because sex is super addicting. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's something our bodies and our minds like chemically deeply react to, and that's awesome. That's the way. What is there's a proverb, I think it's 5 or 6. where it's talking about be intoxicated by the breast of the wife of your youth,
Mm,
and the idea of intoxication
mm,
from the intimacy. And there really is a dopamine, really the kind of addiction that happens, which is it's a bonding thing. You're supposed to be drawn towards one another in that way. And when you are sexually active together, you're supposed to, for lack of better terms, become addicted to each other. And then if you pull the plug on that and you're going through withdrawals essentially from that, you are going to then be vulnerable to all sorts of different things, because loneliness is one of the biggest demons people have to wrestle with. And if you're in this place of marriage, which is the only and right place for sexual activity, and that gets turned to 11, and then you get the carpet pulled out from you, or you starve in that, you're still responsible
sure.
for your actions. Um, you're not just like a werewolf that's allowed to then just go on a rampage, but there is a sort of stumbling block that gets added into someone's life with that man, spouses really need to be aware of that.
Hmm. It's interesting the idea of conjugal rights. Like you said, it's not really a phrase we use often, and probably good, but it's also really weird. It's a hard, if you look at different translations, it's hard to know how to translate that phrase because that's one place, that's a good example of a verse that, depending on your translation, will look very differently. Because the word that's ESV translates conjugal rights, ophalain, can mean like a debt or a duty, what is due, a sum owed, indebtedness, obligation, things like that. And so I was just looking at different, the parallel verses, like in the NIV, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to
And
his wife.
nothing is more of a joy kill or buzzkill than like, I'm here to fulfill a duty.
Right.
Like that.
Uh,
That's pretty rough.
New Living Translation, the husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs. They just kind of make it very explicit, and vice versa. Marital duty, different. The King James, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence.
That's way better. That
Yeah.
King James actually, I think, got that sounding more appropriate
Yeah,
than.
true, and it also depends on how we understand that idea of marital
Oh yeah,
duty,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because what the reason I want to bring that up is because it's fascinating. So what is Paul doing here? Okay, he's been talking about sexual immorality in a hypersexualized culture like Corinth, very similar to ours. He says, flee from it, run for your life. It is something that's unique. That's a unique sin because of the way it affects sin against your own body, but your body's been bought with a price, all sorts of things. Such were some of you, 6:11, and he even mentions like homosexual practices and stuff like that. So like this is like a huge thing, and then now he's describing not only is there a place for it, but he's completely flipping it around because typically what happens in a hypersexualized culture is that we view sex as a thing for us to have pleasure. Like I'm going to get my dopamine fix and I'm going, you know what I mean? Like so it's sex is typically warped because it is used as like a self-serving practice, self-serving device. And what Paul's doing is saying in the marriage bed, it's actually you have a responsibility to serve your spouse and vice versa. And so like that's the idea of like she has authority over my body, I have authority over her body. It's not so I can get what I want from her. So actually, what are you supposed to do with that authority that you have over your spouse's body is actually to serve her and vice versa. And when you have that mutuality expressed, I mean, that is what God created. And that symbolizes the whole relationship. And it symbolizes how we are to live. So it's just fascinating because I think it's almost like if I'm reading this for the first time in Corinth, it's almost like a left hook here. It's like, whoa, I thought You just said to flee from, yeah, I said it's flee from sexual immorality, but there is a place for it, and it is good.
Yeah, it's like the culture of sex is basically as long as it's consensual, you can do with anyone, anywhere,
Hmm.
and it's like a handshake. It's just like,
Right,
nothing to write home about. It's just pleasant
right.
and whatever. Um, which is bizarre to me how they can be treated so casually, but yet you can look at there's a clear, even like legally, huge distinction between something like assault, murder, and rape. Like those are all very different crimes, and even though um, if I think that just kind of turns the lights on to show that no matter what we say, we realize that sexual activity is unique
Hmm.
in amongst us. And so you have one hand being so casual and flippant, and like we mentioned earlier, sex then being this inherently kind of dirty thing, like sex, drugs, rock and roll. Like
Hmm.
it's this rebellious or animalistic carnal nature. And then Paul here in this letter just talking about that sexual morality totally bogus. But then it's also not inherently evil. It has this God-given authority, design, and function to be intimate
Hmm.
and in a really not just doesn't just middle those two, but points a totally paints a very different picture, a true picture of God made sex. Sex is good.
Hmm. And specifically understood within the marital covenant,
Right.
which is why so like in verses 10 and following, um, he speaks to their marriages because it seems like you have some who might be responding, okay, it's good for you mentioned earlier, I was like they can't pick a lane where like some of them are like, oh, let's just let's just throw sex out altogether, and then some are like arrogantly permitting,
Yeah.
this guy to sleep with his stepmom. Like, all right, which is it, And so I think you have some of that in the way people are considering their own marriages and whether they should dissolve them or not. And so, on the one hand, you might have some who are like, okay, again, influenced by some philosophical ideas in their own cultural waters. It's like, oh, maybe marriage is just something that's gonna tie me down. It's like the old
Ball and
ball and chain,
chain
right? And so if I just snip that and tether it, remove that
for the
tether
Lord.
for the Lord, yeah, and I can be divided, have undivided devotion to the Lord, and so, but that's probably like a small percentage. I think most intend to they divorce because they intend to remarry. They want to be with someone else because sexual immorality has been a part of their.
Yeah, marriage is something that's getting in the way
Hmm.
instead of marriage being a responsibility or a ministry, which I think is what exactly is said later about even if you're married to an unbeliever
Right.
and then you make that marriage and your children holy
Yeah.
because you've been given an assignment
Mm.
from God in this. And so really this is putting purpose to sex,
Hmm.
and that sex is not just an urge to be fulfilled, but there's a purpose to sexuality. And if you don't have Christ at the center of that purpose, Satan's going to have a heyday with either the utilization of sex or the removal of sex. And that Christ is in the center, and that then sex is used by Satan to do massive damage.
Yeah. He says in verse 10, to the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. Like we know the teachings of Jesus, and we know the seriousness of marriage and the institution of marriage. But then he includes in verse 11, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. The word divorce and the word separate we typically use in different ways, but um, really synonyms here, like what God has joined together. Jesus says, let men not separate. So, but it's almost like there's in verse 11, it's like, okay, if you think I just need to dissolve this marriage so that I can go hook up with someone else. Hookup culture is not new. He says, all right, well, if she does remain unmarried or reconcile. And I think that it's interesting. He's not just it's not like just a relationship manual where he's just trying to, nitpick here. I think the idea of reconciliation, I mean, that's at the heart of the gospel. Think about that in the second letter, that we've been reconciled and been given the ministry of reconciliation. It's like that sounds beautiful until you start to apply it to people who have hurt you, or you've hurt. And so that should be included in our most intimate relationships as well. But then he also says, so he says that in verse 10 and 11, and this is, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. And what I suggested in the sermon was that he's now like, it's not like I'm going to throw out some opinions now, right? He's too, he is a inspired apostle.
I think this is a huge point, and you mentioned this in your sermon that I want to just revisit, because Paul multiple times in this chapter uses some kind of almost put some headings before his subject that he's about to bring in, where he
Right.
says like "I, not the Lord," or as a command, or he almost, it could almost read as his personal memoirs in the like footnotes of this letter from God to Corinth. And you made an interesting point of that this is not a turning on and off authority from
Hmm.
God to the church, and that Paul, hearkening back to, these are things that the Lord has already told you, and he's like pointing back
Hmm.
towards these ancient or Christ oriented teachings. And then he then brings in the teaching of him as an apostle
Hmm.
to the church. And the teachings of the apostles are not well-informed opinions by spiritually mature leaders.
Right.
They are, like Jesus says, guided into all truth
Yep.
by the sending of the Holy Spirit, like in John 15, and that the apostles' teachings are worthy of devotion, like we talked about earlier in Acts 2. And so when he says, I, not the Lord, that's not like the Lord says it's okay, but I say it's not okay. Like
Right, right, right.
they're not in discord. Like Paul and the Lord are harmonious in the things being presented here. This is an explanation of sorts, or a discernment of what Christ has already taught. And so it's the church getting to be equipped with the truth that Christ has already taught. So I thought that was, you didn't say it exactly in those words, but the idea I think is really important because it helps us fortify and have more confidence in the apostles' teachings, particularly Paul's teachings, because there's a lot of people that don't endure sound teaching because
Hmm.
they hear Paul's words and they really like the idea of Paul having an opinion
Hmm.
instead of Paul having authority
Yeah.
for this, or it being cultural or being, um, personal, instead of this being an extension of Jesus to the church through
Yeah.
Paul.
Which is sort of highlighted right in the last verse of the chapter, where in verse 40, yet in my judgment, she's happy she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think it was Ray Young, our teacher. He taught our Acts class in AIM, but he teaches as
Mm-hmm.
well. Great teacher at Sunset when during the AIM program. And I remember him making a point at the way Luke begins Acts. He says, "In my former book, O Theophilus, I wrote to you about the things Jesus began to do and teach." It's like, okay, what is that assuming? It's like, what it's assuming is that now, O Theophilus, I'm going to write to you about the things that Jesus continues to do and teach. Well, the first thing we see in Acts is Jesus leaves. He ascends, sits at the right hand of God, pours out the Spirit on the church. And the Spirit, and in particular, is gifting the apostles as they lead to the establishment and the foundation of the church and are guided into all truth, as you referenced. And so, in other words, like, one of my pet peeves is when people say, I'm a red letter Christian,
Right.
like
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
red
Yeah.
letter Christianity. It's like, this is all red letter, right? Paul's writing is red letter because Jesus is the one who is the author and perfecter of our faith, he's the one who's guiding Paul as his chosen apostle. Like he handpicked him, and Paul spent a few years with him, right? So anyway, I think that, but yeah, I think it's good. It's good to know that, particularly as we come to chapters like this, because we get into some sensitive subjects like marriage and divorce and things like that. And so to recognize that Paul is not just throwing out opinions nilly-willy. He's
And when he's telling Timothy and others to there's gonna be times when people won't endure sound doctrine, is the reality that sometimes doctrine is not easy to
hmm
receive. And so his teachings here um, are at times like, ugh, this is going to be messy, or
yeah.
like, this is going to be difficult, or at the very least, uncomfortable. And if you are looking to have a very comfortable life in which everything is designed to meet your preferences, you're probably following the wrong person.
hmm
And what the Lord is teaching through Paul is going to, at times, go way outside your comfort zones. And when we take up our cross and follow Him, and I think of Paul's talking about imitate me as I imitate Christ, there is um, there needs to be a awareness of kind of knowing what you signed up for, kind of the
hmm
cost, that type of, adventurous spirit of, man, there's going to be some teachings that are really exciting and encouraging, and there's going to be some other teachings that are like, ugh, this is not going to be that it's going to require endurance. I
hmm
think I think that's the real thing. That doctrine sometimes requires endurance, and some people won't do it. Kind of like the parable of the soils. There's going to be scorching heat that requires root to endure a test of some kind. And some of these, when we're talking about marriage, particularly, and sexuality, those are some of our deepest instincts and desires
mm
and connections and bonds. And when we're starting to pop open the hood and get into like the mechanics of our homes and society and desires and like uh if it's like why people why does someone the amount of effort people go in to find somebody and to be with somebody is such a huge drive. And when this is now reorienting those drives
hmm
and calling them to be submissive to Jesus, and so sexuality is a force to be reckoned with,
hmm
and to make sure it's in its proper place is just massive. And if you're looking to find excuses for your behavior instead of that behavior to be submissive to Christ, you're not going to be able to endure the things that Christ says.
Yeah. It's interesting because the thing he speaks to about as he as an authoritative apostle speaks to things that Jesus did not address. What he's addressing when he says in verse 12, to the rest I say I, not the Lord, he starts to begin to talk about mixed marriages, like marriages where one's a believer, one's not a believer. And like, okay, what do we do with this? Like, because sexual immorality is rampant in their culture. And so if you have someone who's not following the Lord, it's like their background, their sexual history, their understanding and worldview, their it's like what do you like that didn't the last chapter say something about purging the evil person? But he also said something about in chapter 5, like not when I said don't to do anything with sexually immoral people, I didn't mean any people of this world, or else you have to come out of this world. So judge the people in the church. But wait, my husband is not in the church. Like you get some blurred lines here, where it's like, well, how am I supposed to treat my spouse who's not a Christian? Am I supposed to divorce this person now that so that I can remove myself from but I have to come out of the world to do that? You see what I'm saying? There's all sorts of, I imagine, questions that come up for these couples who one person is Christian, one person is not. And so What's fascinating, this is what he says in verse 12 and following. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother, and that's a important word, right,
Mm-hmm.
has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such case, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you'll save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? And so I wonder what it's like for a spouse at this time in a, again, hypersexualized Corinthian culture where it's part of their, not only part of their culture, but part of their religious practices of pagan, pagan ritual practices. And if my spouse has not bowed their knee to Jesus, is not Christ centered, what sort of sexual sins they might be participating in. I know what Jesus said, except for sexual immorality, but they consent to live with me, but they haven't. Like, there's just some mess here. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on this passage, and also something I didn't really get to. I'm just curious what you think about this idea of like, okay, we know, okay, there's the power of the potential impact you might have on your unbelieving spouse. They also throws children in there too. It's like, so in verse 14, the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, he says, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do we do with that?
Well, I think it's just important to kind of define some terms with this to kind of get a layout of what's going on. And first off, holy, this idea of sanctification,
Right?
set apart, and that holy is not saved in this when what's being described here. So the marriage being holy, the spouse being made holy, the kids being made holy, is not explicitly um, salvation because it
Mm-hmm.
concludes with like, how do you know? Because if they're going to be made holy, if that was
Right,
salvation,
right.
it's like, well, now you know.
Yeah.
Ta-da! You're
Yeah.
married. Now they're all saved through, and and that would be a really interesting evangelism tool if that was the case. Like everyone find an unbeliever, date them, marry them, boom. We just doubled all of our connections out.
But I know you're saying that tongue in cheek, but if you look at early church history, the primary reason the church grew so rapidly was because of people living out this chapter,
Wow. Yeah.
because of people marrying unbelievers and then coming to faith.
Well, so what's awesome about this passage is you get your primary objective in like a mission field. So with if you are married to a non-believer, uh, the idea here is, with being holy and committed to them, if they consent to be with you, is this God has called you to peace. For how do you know whether or not you'll save your spouse? It says the saving of your spouse, that God's calling you to peace for the intention of the possibility of the salvation of this person. So the reason why there's now holiness in this relationship, even though only one half of the marriage is saved, but the whole marriage is holy,
Mm-hmm.
is because by you being in this relationship, God has an expectation on that relationship as far as it depends on you and your holiness that God has caused in that relationship. It's now a holy marriage. It is a God sanctified marriage,
Mm-hmm.
in that so the idea of set apart, that marriage is set apart in a mission minded sense of because you're not just any husband, you're now a godly husband.
Mm-hmm.
You're not just any father, you're a godly father. And
Mm-hmm.
so you're bringing godliness, because marriage is not exclusively a Christian practice. Raising children is not, parenting is not an exclusive Christian um, role. But as a Christian, you're a different kind of husband. As a Christian, you're a different kind of father or mother. And that different kind is a holy kind.
Hmm.
And so God has a expectation, a responsibility for those roles. And so you don't just abandon the sinking ship, because without Christ, it is a sinking ship.
Right.
Uh, but you kind of go down with the ship. You know that you're okay, and spiritually, and you might be able to convince them to get off that boat and go to where actually the rock is. And so you are not to abandon them. You are to try to save them. And talking about going out into all the world would be extremely hypocritical if you're not willing to just like roll over in bed and talk to the person that's right there. If And so you don't abandon those closest to you, um, for the sake of the gospel,
Mm.
and especially unless they leave. That's why if they consent, that's huge, because um, there might be eventually like a pearls before swine thing here, where if they leave you, don't spend your whole life chasing them back if they've decided to 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 separate as non-believers and that. But if they consent, then you have fish that have jumped in the boat, and you got to get cleaning.
Hmm. Go out into all the home. Go out to all the home. Yeah, it's interesting because I imagine what Paul is responding to is the idea that might be circulating there. Again, they've wrote this to him, and he's referencing things that they have written. So I don't know if verse 1 is everything they wrote about this subject, or if there are other things they're asking or not. So I don't know if it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman in verse 1 is sort of like a, yeah, referencing that part of their letter or not. We don't know. We don't have that letter. But as he's responding, so if I hear you correctly, what we're suggesting is that the idea that might be circulating in their minds is like, if only one partner is a Christian, then maybe the marriage is unholy, and maybe the children we have are unholy. Like, this is like almost like out of wedlock children, you know. And what he's saying is like, no, 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 the marriage is still sanctified by God. The children are part of your family, and now you have a role in this family to
I,
be used by
I
Him.
think a huge example of this is First Peter chapter 3, verse 1, um, and and 2. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the
Mm-hmm.
conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like they might hear me preach, a man might hear me preach at him and preach the gospel to him, and he might be like, meh. But then his wife, who's a Christian, through her conduct, through her obeying what is talked about in Corinthians of, I have a responsibility to my husband. I'm going to love him. I'm going to be intimate with him. I'm going to provide and be present, and I'm going to live life with him. I'm going to be holy alongside him if he's choosing not to be holy. That conduct will be what communicates the gospel to him. Even though he's not won by obeying the word, he can be won without a word by the conduct of that wife. And so I think that is showing the same thing, but from a different angle of there's holiness in this marriage that is currently 50-50, but who knows, it might become 100 over
Mm-hmm.
time, kind of like water over rock.
Yeah, and I think it's important. I mean, Paul is not at all dismissing the painful marriage that might be, right? Like, I can't even
Yeah,
imagine.
you might be turning the other cheek at home.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
So he's not, I don't like, I mean, we're just reading this, just right through, but he's not at all dismissing it. I think what he's trying to do is to provide hope for what God can do in a marriage through your Christ-centered character.
And I also want to clarify with the turning the other cheek at home, like that's when we're talking about abuse in a
Sure.
home and things. I mean that proverbially, but then even if there is physical abuse, separating for safety's sake, but still having the hope of salvation for the other. And, who knows the amount of counseling or wisdom to navigate that relationship. But you're in a marriage with a design and responsibility from God to save the other person's soul. And the purpose of the marriage is not your personal comfort, but for holiness to be brought into that marriage, and then hopefully encompassing the whole marriage. And so, once again, seeing the purpose of sexuality, seeing the purpose of being in a marriage is for, in these cases, salvation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the idea of reconciliation is huge. Again, we've been given the ministry of reconciliation. So as you said, like go out into all the world or go into your home, right? If there's reconciliation needed in your home, that should be your first step, right?
Yeah,
Again,
primary step.
yeah, your primary step. And we trust in the God of peace and the God of reconciliation. But we also recognize, man, that like there are some circumstances, there's some situations like you talked about abuse, if there's addictions or things like that, and we need a whole lot of help, a lot of counseling, a lot of wisdom. That's why God has created us to be saints together
Yeah.
in a church community. God has given the gift of shepherds within a congregation to help walk through and perhaps even to speak boldly in the name of Jesus to a spouse who's not doing what they should do. Like this isn't Paul's not encouraging in this um, to just like I don't know what word to put. He's not to be a doormat or not to be like you can have strength in Christ, right? You can like your conduct, whether you're a Christian husband with an unbelieving wife or a Christian wife with an unbelieving husband, like this isn't just like a dainty pushover, like stand firm in your faith. And it's like it really is being Christ centered. But part of what Paul is getting at in this chapter, as we'll get to here in just a moment, is that he's talking about marriage and he's talking about divorce and singleness and widows, but what he's really talking about is like how do you be Christ centered regardless of your circumstance. And so that's why he's speaking this way to people who have unbelieving wives or unbelieving husbands is like, don't underestimate the power of reconciliation and the power of what God can do through Christ, even in your most intimate relationships. So shift gears here a little bit, because we've been talking about sex and marriage, but a huge part of this chapter is talking about singleness. So I'm just curious about your thoughts as we read through this chapter, because Paul says in verse 6, as a concession, not as a command. So he does let us know, like this is a concession. Um, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind, one of another. So he talks about singleness a lot in this chapter. So what are some of your takeaways from Paul's teaching when it comes to singleness and the potential benefit of being single?
Well, I see this show up in really weird ways and multiple times in with different groups of people. So let me begin by saying that um, there's kind of at times this like unspoken stigma on single people as like they're not like fully baked spiritual people
Yeah,
yet,
right.
and um, you're kind of broken or off or
Mm-hmm.
incompatible um, if you're not married or you're not as reputable or and we and I think there's maybe some well-intended reasoning with some of that. Like, for example, we see qualifications of shepherds needing to be family people and
Mm-hmm.
having spouse and
Yep.
children. And so we look at that like, oh, well, that's an ideal spiritual person. And if you're not on track for that, then maybe you're not an ideal spiritual person. And we might not say that out loud, but the reasoning I think can sometimes get applied, um, which is understandable reasoning, but it's incorrect reasoning because
Mm-hmm.
then I guess Jesus isn't a very spiritual person. All
Exactly.
right. Like
Do we
it's,
forget that Jesus and Paul were single?
but where it rears its ugly head in other places when you look at other teachings, false teaching of like in Mormonism and other groups where they say, marriage is the like peak dynamic to be in. You need to be married to be spiritual. And then they believe that so deeply and fervently that they then project that even onto Jesus. Like, well, it doesn't say Jesus wasn't married. Maybe what Jesus was married
Yeah, yeah.
to Mary Magdalene or others or
Mm-hmm.
multiple people. Because if marriage becomes a prerequisite to optimize spirituality, and if Jesus was the most spiritual person, well, then he
Right.
probably was married. And
Mm-hmm.
like that's just like, oh, that's just bananas. Um, so another place, I see this sometimes is like, we try to help connect preachers and missionaries to different locations throughout Alaska. And years ago, we were helping a really competent, mature, spiritual guy travel around Alaska. And there was a congregation a few years ago um, that really loved him, but he was single. And they didn't want to have him work there because they were really wanting a married individual, and their reasoning, which again is understandable, but unfortunately I think is not fully wise in that um, we have this idea of you're a more well-rounded, competent servant in leadership. You have more potential.
Mm-hmm.
You have more wisdom if you are married. And one of the cultish things any group can do is to operate with the idea of secret knowledge of
Mm-hmm.
like
Right.
if you get behind this curtain you then find enlightenment and what
Then you'll know.
then you'll know you'll be on our level and we have arrived. Would you like to arrive? Then do jump through these hoops. And you don't have it yet, and you can only have it if you do X, Y, and Z. And we do that sometimes with marriage. And I realized it years ago when I was hearing people say things like, I didn't really understand God until I got married, or until I had kids. And once you have kids, then you'll know what it means to fill in the blank. And again, I think there's a lot of well-intentioned stuff, and you do learn a lot when you get
Mm-hmm.
married and you have kids. And the Lord uses the crucible and the forge of those relationships to help invest in discern things. But you do not need to get married to know what commitment or responsibility or unconditional love looks like, or you don't have to have kids to um, grasp sacrifice
Mm-hmm.
or investing in the future for others or providing and those are places where you definitely learn those things, but there's not secrets in Christianity,
Right.
and we act like these are levels of meeting maturity and signs of spiritual competence,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a real disservice to everyone when that's really bought into and practiced. So, um, singleness, you might be single because you're spiritually incompetent and weird. Like that that totally happens. Uh, but just because you're married doesn't mean you're mature and competent. I've met a lot of married
Right.
basket cases.
Right.
Um, I'm one sometimes.
Yeah. Me
Uh,
too.
and so it really redefining what does it mean to be spiritually mature and spiritually optimized, and that having a family and how you treat people in your family is a great sign of your spiritual health. If your home's a mess, Um, I think that's one of the great benefits of marriage is that if you can learn how to have a family and be married, the amount of social uh, equipment that gives you in leadership, it's just kind of like how it's essential as an elder to have that. Um, the skill set and the giftedness of having a functioning Christian family, the blessings from that start way before shepherding,
Yeah.
like in the position, because your family becomes such a great environment for all sorts of ministry and being light in the community and openings, opportunities, and watering and stuff. It's a huge base of operations
Hmm.
for God, but uh, it is not. Um, it is not the only useful tool in the Lord's shed,
Right.
and it's not his like favorite tool.
Hmm.
Like the Lord loves to do a lot with a little, and so just marriage being cast as this like um, favored condition is really quite dangerous if it's left to go unchecked by um, just genuine discipleship in Jesus.
Yeah. So again, it seems like Paul is addressing two extremes, both with sex and both with marriage. And sex culture has made it ultimate, and it's easy for the church to dismiss it. It's good for not have sexual relations with a woman. They said in chapter 7, verse 1. Marriage, opposite, right? Like culture, very low view. Like I remember reading years ago an article headline. It came across like a Facebook news feed or something. It's just read the headline and kept going, but it referred to some celebrity, Kanye West and Kim Kardashian. They
Okay.
got divorced, but the headline said that they broke up.
Oh, wow.
Kanye West and Kim Kardashian break up. I'm like, they were married.
Yeah.
They have children.
Yeah.
So anyway, just thinking about the way marriage has such a low view in our culture sometimes it's almost like the same as being Facebook official. So it's like you have like a piece of paper now and so your taxes change a little bit and
Yeah, I
that
was
kind of thing.
I was at a restaurant a few years ago, and there was a waitress that was talking with another waitress just a few tables over, and they're talking. I don't know if I could overhear them, unfortunately, but she was talking about how, yeah, we were married for 5 years, and she was like my age or even like a little younger. She's like, yeah, we were married for 5 years, and I'm happy it lasted long as it did, and
Oh,
and
it's
just
so
the
sad.
and it's expected to not last, or it's unsurprising.
I can't believe we made it 5 whole
Yes,
years.
like pat yourself on the back for and just to your point of low view and um that it's your ring you can take on and off like socks,
Yeah,
and it's just it's
right.
not it's not how it's designed.
And so Paul wants to push back against both because he emphasizes already in this chapter the magnitude of marriage and what it is and what it's for and all this. And then also pushes back against the idealization of marriage and says like singleness is a legitimate way of life and it's not just a pre-married state. And makes me think of like churches that have singles ministries. The- Some of that I've seen, like singles ministry is basically just like a Christian mingle. It's just like,
Find your spouse,
yeah, this is a place that, which
or
don't
it's
get me,
treated as like a place for the leftovers.
the leftovers, yeah. And don't get me wrong, like I think, man, if you can find the church is a great place to find a spouse. Like if you can find someone who has, who's Christ-centered and has a like that's if you're looking for a spouse, like go to church. Like
Yeah,
it's a
it's
great.
the right place to shop from. Right pool to throw a line in.
Yeah, exactly. But like singles ministry and what single people, especially people who have chosen to be single, either maybe they've lost their spouse and want to and have chosen to remain a widow or widower, or maybe they've gone through a tragic divorce and but they're like, this is where I am in life. I want to commit myself to Jesus. Maybe they struggle with same-sex attraction, but they want to commit their bodies to the Lord. You're like, whatever their setting might be, like how do we utilize the giftedness that they have
Yeah.
in their circumstance? Like Paul calls it a gift. And Paul says, and so like he gives his rationale later down in verse was it 32, which says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The
Mm-hmm.
unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. His interests are divided, and he goes on. So it's like, man, like what if as a congregation we say like, okay, we have some single folks here for whatever variety of reasons. It's like, what is the Lord doing with them, and how can they contribute to
Right.
the
Spirit
body?
single people should almost be like spiritual special forces
Yeah.
for like cinnamon. Like
Yeah.
like they
Yeah.
they they can go. They can risk more of sorts because if I go out into a super dangerous place, like someone who's raised my kids, like there's
Yeah.
stumbling blocks that I can lay I can leave behind stumbling blocks if I abandon my family for something, but not having that gives you some flexibility, some mobility that others don't have. And I unfortunately I see so many young people, especially young women get I think really boxed in with some things. I remember at church camp years ago. I think I was in high school or just recently got out of high school. I was working at church camp up here, and I remember this talk. I don't know if it was like a purity talk or it was some sort of, it was a serious conversation. And I remember, I think the director at the time then, really great guy, well intended, but he was talking about, um, to the ladies, he's like, really desire someday to be an elder's wife. And like the way it was communicated was like, this is like peak
Mm.
Christianity, is to pursue, like, live a life now with the desire to someday be an elder's wife. And I think that it's, in one way of thinking, um, you know, you desire a noble thing of wanting to serve in that way. But to what ends up happening is you start living day to day with the intention of fitting a mold of this relationship and of this family dynamic, and you're now oriented off of this role and even this marriage. Even if you're not married, like, I'm going to live pure and abstinent, and I'm going to be trying to develop skills and get certain traits so I can become the person that I'm looking for. And you are committed to a marriage that hasn't happened yet. And there's some noble thoughts with that, but what ends up happening is your your life is now revolving around this marriage instead of revolving around the cross.
Hmm.
And that is kind of a Trojan horse of ideas, because it's Christ that makes that marriage holy
Yeah.
instead of the marriage that then somehow optimizes your relationship with Christ.
Some of that, like staying pure for your husband, right? Instead of staying pure for Jesus.
Yeah,
Like that, like a week after the wedding day, the dress is still white. Like purity, as you talked about in 5 and 6, like purity is Christ centered, and it's he.
only Christ centered. Yeah.
Yeah, like you really are unleavened, and he defines that. You made me think of talking about growing up to be an elder's wife. Made me think. So I just a day or two ago on Goodreads came across a book. I put it on my never-ending want to read list. This is kind of where I store like, oh, I'll come back to that. So it's not a book I'm recommending because I've not read it. I believe it's from a different tradition and written from an egalitarian perspective. But the title just like gripped me because it said the title is Becoming the Pastor's Wife, and the subtitle is How Marriage Replaced Ordination as a Woman's Path to Ministry. And of course, she's writing again from an egalitarian perspective, and so but again, I'm not recommending the book. I've not read it myself, but just the idea of the issue she's addressing is like um, the ultimate like level that a woman can get to in a church is being married to an elder or to a preacher, and it's like let me think. When Amber and I first got married, this idea of like preacher's wife, she's the preacher's wife, and like, man, this is Amber, and she's so much better than me, and like most things, more gifted in ministry in most ways. And so recognizing, okay, I recognize I'm not at all trying to diminish my unique calling and unique role as an evangelist and all of that, but thinking about women in ministry, like, man, what a force. Women are gifted in unique ways and are essential to the life of the body. And single women and single men, according to Paul, are not just, like you said, they're not just like the leftovers. Like, this is a gift. And in many ways, it's like, I like your illustration, like special forces, like send them in. Like they have, and of course, what he writes in verse 35, which it's become, I think each podcast we've said there's a new favorite verse in Corinthians. This one at least has become mine in many ways. He says in verse 35, I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord,
Yep.
to Jesus. Talking about being Christ-centered, right? That's the theme of the book of our series. It's like I'm writing this so you can have undivided devotion to the Lord in general, but in particular for like if you can control your sexual desires, like you ought to give singleness a thought. You ought to give it a try because you might be able to do some unique things.
Makes me think of a lot of recruiters for special forces. A lot of them are like, you probably couldn't handle it.
You can't handle
It's like, do
this.
you think you have what it takes? And people rising up to that is what gets them in the door.
Yeah,
Like, I think I could do it,
yeah,
or like challenge accepted,
yeah.
and that inspires them to. So yeah,
Marriage is like the fault, like, well, okay, if rather to marry than to burn with passion, but if you can,
you want to be comfortable your whole life.
exactly.
Yeah, so it's huge to not diminish. We really tend to look down on those different than us.
Yeah,
If you're single, you'd be like, "Oh, I'm so spiritual. I can handle not being married." You could look down on the married people. You're just
yep,
taking the comfy, easy way, nice dad bod. Like you
yeah.
can just have that, um, you know,
Just arrogance.
yeah, arrogance, yeah, superiority, and then likewise, we can do the same thing if it's like, well, you're obviously not compatible with people. You don't play well with others, and you're just self-centered, bachelor who
Oh
can't
yeah,
settle down, put roots down, and if you're, a married man looking over there, and so it's kind of a just we tend to think we got to figure it out. If you're not like me, you're probably not as good, and that's wrong.
right. Yeah, and I mean that's why he refers to these as gifts, right? In verse 7, I wish all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. And the way I understand that is, particularly in this context, that like the married man, the married woman in that marriage, like that's a gift. That setting in life is a gift that you can use to have undivided devotion to the Lord. Singleness, like if you're in that setting in life, that's a gift that God
Yeah,
has given. So use your gifts to glorify God in your body, right? You're
yeah.
not throwing your body with a price.
And whether you're married or you're single, you are both capable and expected to have whole and complete devotion to the Lord.
Yeah.
And so you don't have more devotion one way or the other. You have different gifts and responsibilities, but in your marriage, you're devoted to the Lord. In your singleness, you're devoted to the Lord, and that's one is not superior or less than the other.
And both have their own challenges. Like if you're single, you have the potentially heightened temptation of sexual morality. If you're married, you have the heightened potential for distraction and making idols of your family. Like so, both ways you are called to have undivided devotion.
And just you just saying that, I think is important to have it said that you're right. The single person might have increased temptation for sexual morality, but like we read earlier about in a marriage, is that if you are not diligent with each
Yeah,
other,
yeah,
you have invitation for Satan to get in there. And so marriage does not just make you immune to
exactly.
sexual
I'm
immorality and
glad you said
temptation.
that.
And so sometimes people can look at marriage as just like, I'm out of control. I need marriage is a cage I can put myself in to keep myself safe. And I'm just like as a sex outlet.
Hmm.
And um, man, that's not the function of the relationship
And people
either.
have used Paul as
Right.
justification in verse 2,
Yes.
but because of temptation to sexual morality, each man should have his
I'm
own
so
wife.
addicted to pornography. I need to go get married to somebody to help curb this.
Yeah,
And like that's not how this works.
yeah, and that's why he redefines sex within the marriage as like she has authority over your body, you have authority over her body, and it should be used as a way to serve, not just to get the
Yes.
fix. So, but undivided devotion, as we're coming to an end of this study and this episode, I mean that's really the heart. What my big takeaway in prepping for the sermon was like that's really the heart of it of this. Like again, this is not he's not just writing this like super long manual on every single relationship circumstances. He uses settings in life, marriage, divorce, singleness, widowhood, and he's using these lenses to think through what to do and how to flee from sexual immorality, and specifically to address their question in verse 1. But he wants to, in all of these conversations, to get at the heart of it, like what's underneath all of it, and that is Like, how are you going to be Christ-centered in your relationships? Like, how are you going to have undivided devotion? And I think that's why in the middle of this, and I think it's a good place for us to end. This is a verse that I've heard you reference a couple of places. It could be a podcast, could be a class, could be a drive around town. So
All the
it
above.
all overlaps these days, but the idea of the Lord's assignment, I think
Yeah.
you have like a lesson in that specifically, or
Mm-hmm.
so in verse, I think it's a good place for us to end, really, just 17 through 24. This is what I had one of our brothers read before the sermon yesterday, because I didn't really get to talk about a lot, but I kind of ended here, both in verse 17 and verse 35, as a way to like bring it home. But read for us verse 17 through 24.
Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. That'd be interesting to figure out what exactly that means. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God.
Man, so many thoughts here. Again, random, it seems like a random time to bring up circumcision, Paul, but he likes to do that. But he's getting to a really huge point here. Living the life the Lord has assigned you, that regardless of your circumstance, you can glorify God. And he again appeals back in verse 22. You were bought with a price. He's talking particularly about bondservants of being don't become bondservants of men. But again, appealing to that theological principle he laid down at the end of chapter 6, like you're not your own, you're bought with a price. Glorify God in your body. How do we glorify God in our bodies, Paul? And he's saying you can do that regardless of what circumstance you find yourself. Live the life the Lord has assigned. I just find this fascinating because, you know, it's easy to, especially when topics like marriage and divorce, I mean remarriage, man, it's easy to go, it's like, okay, I'm going to go to chapter 7. That's one of the places I can go of First Corinthians. I'm going to go here and like figure out what I can or can't do. You know, it's like, man, we really miss the point if we
Yeah.
do that.
The problem with boundaries is we try to see how close to them we can get.
Yeah. And it's completely in the face of what Paul's point of the chapter
Yep.
is, that regardless of where you find yourself, and he acknowledges that there might be changes in your circumstances, like don't seek to be free, but if opportunity arises, you can take that. And don't divorce. If you do divorce, remain unmarried or seek reconciliation. So like his whole point is not to create a manual for this, but he is trying to have a theological principle of live and glorify God right where you are.
And that your life is on assignment, not a pursuit of happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And making sure you wake up, no matter your condition, you wake up in the morning knowing that God has an assignment for you, instead of waking up in the morning and figure out, okay, what can I do to be happy? And you're going to actually find happiness in accepting his assignment. And whereas you're going to find death, misery, and self destruction if you're just looking to indulge yourself. And it's what Christ says, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it.
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to find your life, you're going to lose it. And so losing your life in the assignment of Christ, having a Christ centered life is where you actually find life. If you're looking for life outside of Christ, you're just picking a different flavor of poison.
Yeah. So if you're in a Christian marriage, you have an assignment. If you are if you're married to an unbelieving spouse, you have an assignment. If you are single, you have an assignment. If you've gone through a tragic divorce, you have an assignment. If you have lost your spouse and you're like, I don't know exactly how I'm going to, do life together anymore. Everything, my faith has been intertwined with my spouse for decades. You have an assignment.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have an assignment, you have a purpose. God has intentions. He is using you in your circumstance. And so it's so easy for me and for many of us to wait on our circumstances to change before we dive fully into faithfulness. And so, it's particularly with things like singleness, it's like this isn't like we're not like in a spiritual holding pattern where once the things line up, now we can dive in. It's like, no, no, no. Right where you are, live as you are called. And yeah, your circumstances might change, but you're not waiting on the change of circumstance to be faithful and Christ centered.
Yep. Bring the change into your environment instead of waiting your environment to change.
Yeah. So I enjoyed the study. Man, it was a challenge preparing for the sermon, but just I am my big takeaway from this study and from this book is that like Corinthians, the church in Corinth, they're a bunch of messy people, just like me and you and the church here and every congregation I've been to. And we really are saints together. You really are unleavened. Such were some of you, but you have been washed, you have been sanctified, you have been justified. And so, what does it look like to live a Christ centered life in our wisdom, in our unity, in our purity, and now in our relationships? But we can do it, right? There's something. God is using the church. He's using us. He's using our families. He's using our singleness for a purpose, and He has assigned us to glorify Him with our bodies. So we thank you for joining us, and the charge is wherever you find yourself, live the life God has called you to live and glorify God in your body.
Thanks for joining us for this episode, and God bless you, and we'll see you next time.